Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate you taking the time and effort to be with us this afternoon. And welcome to Generous Futures, Combating Islamophobia. My name is Enver Saluji, and I'm a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at our university. And I'm really honored, excited about this panel today and about the live discussion that's about to follow. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel in season 2 of the Generous Futures series. Generous Futures brings the diverse identities, experiences, and perspectives of the philanthropic community to the forefront. Before beginning the discussion, I would like to thank our lead sponsor of the series, the TD Bank Group, for helping to advance these important discussions. The TD Bank Group has been a great sponsor of our university, and we are delighted that they have joined us on this journey of understanding. Today, we shine a spotlight on the vital role of charitable giving in combating Islamophobia. The Muslim community in Canada has been here for a very long time and has deep roots. It has faced Islamophobia, but despite all of those challenges, it is a community that has continued to take its rightful place in our society and continued to give back to our society. Our panel of senior leaders will unpack how philanthropy is confronting Islamophobia and helping create a safe and supporting environment for all of us. We'll discuss the ways in which the concepts of fitra and zakat are helping share and guide charitable interests. For Muslims, zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam and is a way in which we can redistribute wealth to those in need. Zakat al-fitra is one of the 2 types of obligatory zakat and is to be paid during the month of Ramadan before the Eid prayers. Convention has it that it should be equal to the price of 1 meal, specifically 2 kilograms of wheat, barley, rice, or flour, around $10 a person in the household. So giving and philanthropy are an important part of Islam and constitute an obligation for Muslims, and that enables us to give back to the society of which we are a part. For today's discussions, I will pose questions to our panelists, and following this, time permitting, I will ask our panelists to respond to questions submitted by you when you registered. I'm now really, truly delighted and honored to introduce you to our panel of leaders. The first person is Nabila. Nabila Ixtabalan leads human resources and corporate affairs for Walmart Canada. Her career includes nearly 20 years of leadership and business development experience with some of the world's most recognized brands. She's truly a leader. Nabila is especially passionate about enterprise-wide transformations, the future of work, change management, diversity, and inclusion and organizational design. In 2019, Nabila joined as a board advisor to the Future Skills Center of Canada. Nabila, salam and welcome.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
The second speaker is Chris Blofeld. Chris is a passionate Muslim American entrepreneur committed to reviving the goodness of humanity He is the founder and CEO of LaunchGood, the world's largest faith-inspired crowdfunding platform that has raised over $250 million across 131 countries for over 33,000 campaigns from Muslims, repairing vandalized Jewish cemeteries, to sending hijabi athletes to the Olympics. Chris has been invited across the world to participate in premier events, from dinner at the White House to speaking at South by Southwest to teaching entrepreneurship in Asia. Salam and welcome, Chris.
Hey, Salam alaikum. Thank you so much. Really excited to be here.
Unfortunately, our third speaker, Amugan Ahmad, is unable to join us today for this discussion. So allow me to begin our panel discussion. I'm going to ask each panelist now to answer the following questions, and I give them a minute each to answer the question. Nabila, I'm going to turn to you and then to Chris. I'll ask the same question for each of you. So Nabila, what is your first memory of generosity, and how do your memories influence your perspective on this important topic?
Thank you so much, Anwar. So this is maybe one that I think a lot of people can relate to. So I'm first generation American by birth, Canadian by choice, but my parents and grandma is from Lebanon. And so when she first landed in the States, she was in California, and she also grew up on a farm and as a farmer. And so for her, one of the things that drove her crazy in California was all of these fruit trees that were in front yards and lined on streets, and fruit, unpicked fruit in a fruit tree to her was just like an unthinkable concept. And so as a young person, she would make us, because she didn't speak English very well, knock on strangers' doors and ask them if it was okay if she picked their fruit. And so of course, as a young person, first generation, you're kind of like embarrassed that your grandma is making you go to some stranger's door to ask them if you can pick their fruit. But you know, this is my first memory of generosity for many reasons. First of all, there's the generosity of the person who planted that tree in the front yard and not the backyard, right? So there was some kind of thought to that. There's the generosity of the tree itself, and that it bears fruits, and that it benefits humanity from that perspective. There's a generosity of the neighbor who allowed this stranger to pick that fruit, and you know, didn't tell us to just keep on going. And then there's the generosity of my grandmother, who inevitably, you know, picked this fruit and then gave it away. So even at the time as a young person, I found that as an embarrassing endeavor. You know, I reflect on it now as probably being one of the most beautiful depictions of generosity, and something that I really appreciate in terms of my grandmother and the fact that she went to that effort to make sure that fruit didn't go to waste and it found its right place.
What a wonderful story. Chris, over to you.
Well, I'm going to go off script a little bit and answer a related but different question. So instead of my first memory of generosity, I say, you know, one of the things is just my experience with generosity, especially and to break the ice. You know, if you guys are wondering why a guy named Chris is speaking on a panel about Islamophobia, like I became Muslim 20 years ago, and that's this whole other story webinar we're not going to go into now. But one of the things about entering into the Muslim community 20 years ago, I was stunned by how generous of a community it is. You know, so not to say my family's not generous. Like we, you know, they put like the tithe in the church basket every Sunday and give a little charity here and there. But like within the Muslim community, kind of like Nabila is talking about, it's really like infused into the way they interact with one another. Like I've never seen people fight over a bill, for example. You know, but within the Muslim community, if people are watching this, they know it's like very common. Like they'll be like extremely offended if you try to get up and pay for a bill and you're like a guest. They're like, oh, let's split it. Like there's not any splitting happening. Or in my travels across the world, like, you know, people would literally like bring me into their families. You know, it doesn't matter where I'm going or what's happening. It's really an incredible phenomenon. And, you know, the world needs that generosity, because when people treat each other generously, it brings us all closer together. And I could go on many, many stories. I'm not going to waste our time in here, but that's to answer your question. That's my answer.
That's a great answer, and it does speak to the generosity of the community, but it also speaks to the history of the Muslim community, and it's infused in us from birth, right? It's not just a pillar of Islam, but it from the time we are young and are cognizant beings, it becomes a part of who we are. So
Exactly.
it's indistinguishable from our identity as people. Nabila, I'm going to ask you a very specific question. You lead HR and corporate affairs in one of the biggest organizations in the world. How important is it to challenge Islamophobia in the workplace? And how can organizations better support their employees who are experiencing Islamophobia? Do you have any advice for the corporate community seeking to confront and dispel Islamophobia in their respective organizations? And Chris, I'll ask you a separate question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first step in addressing this question is understanding what Islamophobia is. And I don't want to assume that everyone listening knows what it is. So Islamophobia is defined as an unfounded or disproportionate fear or hatred of Islam or Muslims or people perceived to be Muslims that leads to violence or systemic discrimination. And even in the way we describe Islamophobia, often when we think about other hate-related circumstances, we talk about Asian hate or Black hate. And even in Islamophobia, we don't talk about Islamic or Muslim hate. We talk about Islamophobia as if there's some kind of like, validation to the phobia ever existing, their phobia being about the faith. So that's really important. Also, it's important to understand that Islamophobia is often gendered. So it's reinforcing these views of patriarchy and Muslim men as violent terrorists and Muslim women as subjugated victims. It's also very intersectional with other systems of racism. So our Black Muslims have, many more dimensions they have to face than, Asian Muslims, for example, or, individuals who come from different places. So, and then I think a really important fact also is the recognition of its pervasiveness in both the US and Canada, but more specifically in Canada, 40%, just to really quickly, 47% of Canadians support banning headscarves in public. 56% of Canadians believe that Islam suppresses women. And more than half of people living in Ontario believe the Islamic doctrine promotes violence. And 51% of Canadians promote and support government surveillance of mosques. This is 20 years after 9/11. This is the pervasiveness of Muslim stereotypes and, anti-Muslim stereotypes and Islamophobia in Canada. And I know, because I've studied this in the US, that's very common. That's also very common in the US as well. So I think the first thing we need to do is educate ourselves. So as corporate leaders, as individuals in the enterprises, we need to educate ourselves on what it is. And then it's really about, having the courageous conversations. I've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion work for many, many years, and I'm optimistic that the conversation is changing. But we are still very uncomfortable within the business world talking about race and religion. And we are very, I think, ill-equipped of how to have those conversations. So we need to put the same rigor and effort behind racial equity and religious inclusion as we have other dimensions of diversity. That's number one. We need to have the courageous and uncomfortable conversations. And I think we're starting to do that for the first time ever. I've seen enterprises actually having conversations about things that I think 5 or 10 years ago we probably never would have faced, but we're still, I think that's still not happening often enough. And then I think results matter. So we need to track and report on the commitments that we're making. It's not enough just to sign pledges and make LinkedIn posts. As organizations, we actually have to report on our commitments and hold ourselves accountable. And the last one, these are really wicked challenges. These are challenges that are really, permeate the culture of our psyche, of society. Let's not underestimate how deep these biases go. So to really address that, we need to build shared value networks. And one of the things I'm really proud of is that at Walmart Canada, in partnership with Walmart.org, we've committed $20 million over the next 5 years in philanthropic giving to organizations who are doing the systemic work on the ground to address systemic racism. So, these are the kind of partnerships, because we as an enterprise, we can't do this work ourselves, but we need to have the partnerships with organizations that are doing that work and make sure that they have the fuel and the funding to keep moving forward.
That's really amazing. And I think you're pointing to the importance of the development of communities of solidarity, which is so, so important. Thank you so much. Chris, can you please tell us more about the incredible work LaunchGood is doing to combat Islamophobia? How is LaunchGood's growth connected to issues of Islamophobia? What role do Muslim leaders and allies play in raising funds to combat Islamophobia? And it's very much linked to the issues that Nabila just talked about, which is the growth of sort of global, national, regional communities of solidarity.
Cool. Well, to be clear, LaunchGood, if people don't know it, it's sort of like a GoFundMe focus on the Muslim community. So we help people fundraise. And in that light, LaunchGood is not the sage on the stage. We're the guide on the side. So all we can do is elevate and boost the efforts of people that themselves are going out and fighting Islamophobia, that themselves are going out and building bridges. I think we're pretty good at that boosting of it, but really we're only a reflection of what already exists in the communities. And along those lines, speaking about this with Islamophobia, it's really interesting. We didn't start LaunchGood with the intention of an Islamophobia platform, a combat Islamophobia platform. It was just to support, fundraising within the Muslim community or with allies in the Muslim community, however they saw fit. But early on, we saw, actually the first campaigns didn't have to do with Islamophobia, but the opposite. It was actually some kind of racist issues that we had in America. I remember we called them like flash campaigns, these campaigns that go viral very fast. Was an African-American Muslim sister here in America was raising money for some Black churches that were being burned down in the South. And she's trying to raise $10,000 and it went viral and raised $100,000. And these are like Muslims raising money for that church. And then, it was very popular. And then later, some of the same people involved there got involved after Trump was elected, because when Trump was elected, there was a number of Islamophobia incidents, but also anti-Semitic incidents, racist incidents, anti-immigrant incidents. And so what happened, specifically with the anti-Semitic incidents, a number of Jewish gravestones were being toppled and destroyed across the country. And a Muslim charity called Celebrate Mercy decided to raise some money to fix those gravestones. They were going for, I think, $20,000. They ended up raising $300,000 to fix Jewish gravestones. That same organization, a year later, when there was a horrible shooting in a Pittsburgh synagogue, created campaigns that Muslims United for Pittsburgh Synagogue. And that raised about $500,000. It got into the New York Times, Stephen Colbert, all of this. And then what's beautiful is when, I don't want to say it's our turn, but when there was an Islamophobic incident, a few months later with the shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, in a mosque, that same synagogue in Pittsburgh now rallied and raised money for the victims in Christchurch. So that's one of the effects of LaunchGood. One of the things that we try to do is give people an outlet in these horrible moments of tragedy, show where their sympathies really lie. And we know the dollar speaks, like talk is cheap, right? And money speaks louder than words. And so, we can say, hey, how many times, especially Muslims, how many times do we hear like, oh, no, Muslims and Jews don't hate each other. We're all children of Abraham, right? And it kind of gets like tiring to hear that over and over again. But when you actually see Muslims raising money for Jews and Jews raising money for Muslims, you realize, no, this is a real thing. This could be our future if we choose to invest into it. And so that's a little bit about what LaunchGood has done and continues to do. Those are some of the big examples, but all the time, we do have efforts where people are raising money to support one another. And it goes across communities, which is really beautiful as well.
That's amazing work. I mean, the two of you are just simply marvelous. Nabila, and I did read this piece and I thought it was really important and really powerful. Earlier this year, you did write a piece in the Globe and Mail entitled, How Often Do I Need to Tell My Kids That Most Canadians Don't Hate Muslims? How can we support our Muslim youth and ensure that they don't face discrimination in the future? And conversely, I'm going to add something else. How can we talk to youth who are not Muslim to ensure that they become part of this broader global, national, citywide movement of voices against Islamophobia, and that they make common cause with Muslim youth and don't see them as other?
Yeah, thank you, Anvar. So, when I think of large societal challenges, I often see them as movements, right? And there's always three legs to that movement. There's an individual dimension. So what do I do in my square meter, kind of in that square that I live and breathe and, exist in? What do organizations do? And what does society and our sister, the societal structure need to do? And so I think with this question, I think about it in that way. Unfortunately, many Muslim youth are growing up with the biases that have been formed since 9/11, the war on terror, the see something, say something, the surveillance, kind of these stereotypes that are, embedded into our psyche in the West. They're actually raised in that. And to a degree, it affects their own sense of identity, and it definitely affects their experience. 2/3 of Muslim youth in Canada report having some experience with Islamophobia or Muslim hate. So it is, again, really pervasive. So one of the things that we do as parents and individuals is counter that narrative, right? That to make sure that we build confidence in the Muslim identity, and that there is no contradiction between being Muslim in the West and Western society, that that narrative is just holistically false. And so as parents and as adults and as someone that children look up to, you have to counter that narrative, you have to actively counter that narrative. And that's the difference between saying you're not a racist to being anti-racist. When the system is defaulted to a racist system, you have to be actively pushing against it. So I think individuals need to do that. You can only do that if you really educate yourself and make sure you have the information to do that. Schools need to play a really big role here. NCCM, actually, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, just released a proposal for a new set of recommendations, and one of them is that there's changes to our educational system based on the calls that we've heard across the country, that young people need to be educated in the school system to help them understand Islamophobia, and to make sure that there aren't narratives in our educational system that are reinforcing those false stereotypes and kind of creating a vicious circle, both within the Muslim identity and with non-Muslims and their belief system around Muslims. And I use this, and then there's society. I think, again, we need to have the systems that are around us, actively address these issues. And I love the way that as a Muslim community or religious community or a philanthropic community, we rally when incidences of horror occur. Of course, that's a show of solidarity and support, but we need to also rally and raise funds and support creating, youth-focused education around Islamophobia and making that available in all of our schools. We need to figure out downstream, how do we address the systemic roots of this problem and support and fund that work. And that work is often not as front and center as rebuilding a church or rebuilding a synagogue, which needs to be done as well. But we need to find the funding and resources and rally behind that work as well. And the organization's doing it because it needs support and it needs to be brought to the surface. And I'll give you one. I love this example. I think if we think about probably one of the most celebrated movies in the last 10 years, Black Panther, that was kind of recognized as one of the most representative movies of our time. The opening scene, right, of that is the Black Panther saving women from hijabi, from a Muslim terrorist group in burqas. So in the most kind of celebrated film of our time around inclusion and representation, even that film opens with a scene reinforcing a stereotype of Islamophobia. And that's what's happening in the psyche of our youth and the psyche of society, and it needs to be broken. And it's going to take a lot of effort and time to do it.
Great, thank you so much. And yes, you're right. Breaking those tropes, even in contemporary media and film, is a real challenge. Chris, building on that, how then do we build alliances between different faith communities to combat hate? more broadly? And is there a role for philanthropy in breaking down these boundaries and in combating hate and building solidarity?
I just want to say for Nabila, thank you. I totally forgot about that from Black Panther, but it's so true. And that's like, actually, that's pretty depressing.
Chris, the fact that you didn't see it just goes to show how numb we are to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the issue.
Absolutely.
We are so conditioned to perceive ourselves
You're
as
right.
Muslims, and we've conditioned society to see ourselves as a de facto kind of stereotype of terrorists, that we don't even see it ourselves, and our youth don't see it either. And that's the part of what's reinforcing these biases.
Yeah.
I remember there was a study, I think by ISPU or somebody in America, that found that the two most hated groups to the general American public were like North Koreans and Muslims. I'm like, oh my God, like Muslims are so low. They're like down there with, North Korea, like a terrorist state with nuclear ambitions. Like, I was like, oh man, we got a lot of PR work to do. But the plus side is that once people actually get to know Muslims, they have a very positive experience. And I think that's true with all of humankind, right? That once we get to know the other that's been so, antagonized and villainized, and we see, no, they're actually people just like us. They're mothers and fathers and grandparents and students and doctors, whatever they are. They're just humans like us. It really helps. To tie that into your question, Anwar, I do believe that we all have a role, but the responsibility does lie with the groups that have the most power, have the most responsibility. I know Muslims, it's actually, I'm in a book club, we're just having a discussion about how a lot of values, for example, Muslims have, they may be aligned with some traditional Christian values, right? And some people are pushing, why don't we have more alliances there? And it's like, we're not opposed to it, but the problem is, like, most of those people also hate us and believe we're like the Antichrist and all this stuff. Like, what are we supposed to do? Like, how are we supposed to make inroads in there? And I just want to give credit to Ryerson University for putting on this event, giving us a place to share our voices, to have these conversations. Like, this is exactly what we need. We just need it over and over and over and over again at a large scale. I certainly, Muslims have to do their part, reaching out and stuff. But I really find most of the time Muslims are pretty receptive. I think we have to get out there and, especially those with power, reach out to the Muslim community and others and just say, like, hey, I want a close relationship. I want to work together. What can we do together? Because we'll find a way. Like, at the very least, we'll have a cup of tea, right? As far as philanthropy goes, I think Nabila brought up an awesome example of what Walmart is doing. And if we can scale that, that's pretty incredible. There's, reminds me, I'll tell two things really quick. One is, it doesn't always have to be money, right? And there's a famous saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he said that even a smile can be charity, right? And I would say, actually, that's what most of the time we want. It's just to be treated fairly, to be treated kindly, to be treated respectfully. We're not all going to agree with each other, but what makes the project of Canada, the project of America, so exceptional and unique is it's a country where we can be so diverse and have so many different values and come from so many different backgrounds, but live harmoniously together. We don't want to go back to, for example, Europe 300 years ago, where you have like Protestants and Catholics and everyone fighting each other. And that's not like the whole reason of, America, or one of the dreams, the visions of it was like a pluralistic society. And we have to fight for that. The second thing I say, in terms of tangibly, does philanthropy have a role to play? Absolutely. I think really back to this, example, unfortunately, in Canada, in your guys' backyard, in London, Ontario, this past summer with the Salman family. This was a Muslim family. They were dressed in their traditional cultural clothes. I think they were standing waiting to get picked up at a bus stop, or they're walking on the sidewalk. And this man, in a pure act of hate and Islamophobia, just ran them over and killed, most of those family members. There was a LaunchGood for that family to raise funds for the surviving boy and create what we call a everlasting charity in their family's name. And that and another effort raised over 2 million Canadian dollars combined. And it's not about the money, but it's a signal of where do people's feelings lie. And it's not normal to raise $2 million. What ends up happening is like it gets picked up on the news media and all these outlets, and people really like learn about these stories and pay attention and realize it's a really big problem. But also they can lend their voice to it to show, where do they support. So it's one small example, but yeah, I definitely think philanthropy does have a role to play in this.
Great, thank you so much. Nabila, a similar question to you. What do you think are some of the successful ways we can build coalitions and alliances to confront hate, not just Islamophobia, but also hate, discrimination against Indigenous people, against people of color, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris has already mentioned many great examples. So at the end of the day, I think what it comes down to is, as individuals and as organizations, like this is a really like a societal issue, right? And it's huge. So I think you have to decide where you want to focus your energy. And, I think we would love to go after every systemic barrier and every racial issue and every kind of dimension of racism that exists, but we can't, right? I think, but collectively, if everyone kind of declares the thing that they want to affect and address and puts the time, talent, and energy behind it, whether it's individually or as organizationally, societally, we can start to move the needle on these things. So for example, at Walmart Canada with our shared value network, we've specifically called out Black and Indigenous Canadians, that we want to address the systemic barrier that Black and Indigenous Canadians are facing. And we want to address it in specific dimensions. And so we're going out and we're looking for, organizations that are working on these issues on the ground. And then, as I said, supporting them with charitable giving, and also with using our size and scale to help advance their efforts. So, how do we use what the enterprise does well, what Walmart Canada does well, to actually in the business to let, to further the effort. So I think it's not, to Chris's point, it's not always just philanthropy and giving, it's leverage. How do you leverage the talent in your organization? How do you leverage the scale of organization? How do you leverage the power of economic opportunity that organizations provide to address systemic issues that exist? For example, we're really focused on amplifying the businesses and the voices of Indigenous entrepreneurs. We just recently, offered T-shirts on the day, on Orange Shirt Day, the Day of Truth and Reconciliation, the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. And we partnered with Phyllis, the founder of the Orange Shirt Foundation, asking for her permission if we first enforce we can do it, co-designing it and printing it with an Indigenous supplier, and making sure that 100% of the proceeds went to the Orange Shirt Foundation to further their efforts around truth and reconciliation. And we also issued a shirt to all of our associates working that day. So on September 30th, when you walked in our stores, we used in size or scale to amplify the voices of that of the need for reconciliation. All of our associates wearing orange shirts across the whole country. That for me is a great example of how we use the organization size and scale, not to address this, an opportunity in society that furthers an important systemic issue within the community. And that, was both a combination of giving, but using the size and scale of an enterprise. So I think that, along with shared value networks, are, in my belief, and I think also the work that individuals need to do. Because I also think that, ignorance is not bliss, and you can't just accept that you don't know anymore. You have to take responsibility for your own work and educating yourself and then acting on what you know.
Great, thank you so much. So Chris, is there a role for government in the combating of Islamophobia? Oh
yeah, absolutely. And that might be even something some of the guests listening in can speak to more. I can speak from, we've seen, unfortunately, like just when Trump got elected and he was saying things before he got elected, like, he thinks Islam hates America and Islam hates us. And what do we see after he gets elected? A ton of Islamophobia incidents. We had so many mosques burned down. And it's not just Muslims, by the way, like I mentioned, the anti-Semitic attacks, anti-immigrant attacks, just one thing after another. So 100%, the policies of the government, the attitudes of the leadership, they have a tremendous impact, both on the healing side and on the perpetuating hate side. Even policies like anyway, I'm not going to go into it. Maybe if people have questions, they really want to know, I'll go into the policies. I'm not going to go into it now though, but at 110%, the governments have a huge role to play because they ultimately, hold a lot of the power in society.
Great, thanks.
If I could just, Anwar, just build on that really quickly.
Yeah.
I kind of think about the war on drugs, right? If you remember, for those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, and that famous, like, this is your brain on, drugs, and this is your brain off drugs. Or just kind of the recognition that smoking and nicotine was harmful, right? Once there was acknowledgement that this is harming society, and government played their role, whether it's the public health or it's the federal government, or played its role in educating society and recognizing the societal ills that are come out of drug use or nicotine, right? There was a movement in society for education and awareness, and and then support for people to recover. And again, I just think of that, like, if we had the same kind of effort around racism, or how could we educate society in the same way that we have created campaigns around smoking, as an example, and try to eradicate the use of nicotine in smoking. So there are examples of us doing it. We just haven't applied that thinking, I think, to this challenge.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is about putting the public good at the center of all our discourses.
Usually when the governments declare war on something, it just makes it worse.
Yes. War on drugs is not a good example. I'm just saying more about the campaign of that.
Yeah, it's about the public good, and it's about the public commons, and for us to capture that in a way that allows us all to be part of a society that's more inclusive.
Yeah, and I think, again, the policies have to be written inclusively, because I use the war on drugs as a great example. It was hugely disproportionately disenfranchising and to the Black community in America specifically. So it's not a good example of a policy. It's more around kind of the effort and the movement and the voice of the government to put the
So Nabila, it's a good segue to the question I have very specifically for you, because you've lived on both sides of our border in the US and in Canada. And you gave us some really interesting and thought-provoking data on attitudes in Canada. Do you think, how would you compare and contrast the experiences of Muslims in the two countries? And do you think there are enough supports available in Canada for Muslim communities that face Islamophobia?
Yeah, so I think maybe to put in context, 3% of the Canadian population identify as Muslim. 1% of the US population identify as Muslim. So as much as Islamophobia and Muslims are, I think, to Chris's point, like the target of all ailment in the United States, it's 1% of the US population. And I also think it's really important that, like, Muslims in America, Muslims in Canada are widely diverse. We are not a monolithic group. And again, I think there's a stereotype or perception of Muslims that is actually very different than reality. So we, have to understand the diversity of the community in both the US and Canada. I've also lived in Europe, and before recently coming back to Canada, spent some time in Sweden. This is kind of, when I reflect on this is one of the things I've learned. There's a big difference between multiculturalism and, I would say, intentional multiculturalism and kind of inclusion and acceptance of a multicultural society. And I kind of compare it in Sweden to kind of a very human rights oriented organization, but not a very multicultural society. Sweden's a very homogeneous country. And of course, they're kind of a pillar in the global world as an advocate for human rights, but very homogeneous. Whereas in Canada and the US, we have a very diverse population. What I've noticed, and the difference is, it's really in the narrative of how we educate ourselves. So in the US, we hear that it's a melting pot. In Canada, we say it's a mosaic. In the US, we talk about the US is a country of settlers. in Canada, we talk about Canada being a country of immigrants where people can bring their uniqueness. So I would say the narrative of the countries and how we educate ourselves in terms of our origins is very different. Mm-hmm. And that difference is not subtle and it's not insignificant. So, that's because it permeates how we educate our children. It permeates our psyche in terms of what we believe we are as a country, or as what we want to be and what we want to stand for. So I think the ambition of Canada to be in that Canadian kind of experience, to be a truly multicultural, inclusive society where you don't have to assimilate, lose your language, your faith, or your way of life to be Canadian, is very different than the narrative that is predominantly believed and communicated in the US, and I think in a lot of European countries, where assimilation and melting in is part of the experience in the US. So I think that's an important distinction. At the same time, I'm very actively challenging the reality in Canada, because as I wrote in my article and recently, I feel like I'm having deja vu. You start to see the series of events that are happening and unfolding in Canada, very, very similar to what's been happening and unfolding in the US for the last 10 plus years. And so there is clearly an undercurrent of sentiment that needs to be addressed in Canada. And I think we're just starting to face that.
Great. Thank you so much. Chris, since you started LaunchGood in 2013, you've raised over $150+ million in 146 countries to support Muslims worldwide. Nothing short of amazing, not really. What's next on the horizon for LaunchGood?
Well, what's next on the horizon, there's a lot of products in the pipeline. I don't want to talk about that too much, and I don't want to make this too much about LaunchGood itself. But I think what relates to our topic today is we hope to do a lot more when it comes to personal fundraising and partnerships, even with organizations like, I'm not putting Walmart on the spot, but Walmart, if they're doing some initiative where they're putting money in, why not partner and allow people to raise that money themselves and maybe get it doubled? We've done a number of these type of efforts, and we find that, when individuals can fundraise and they see that institutions are backing them, for example, doubling their donations, it really is empowering. It gets them so excited. And it's a win-win because they're going out there, getting hundreds of people to pay attention to the fact that, Ryerson University or whoever is putting their money behind this initiative. So hopefully you guys will see a lot more of that, a lot more opportunities. LaunchGood is out here very much focused on, how can we provide, more good in the world. So hopefully you'll see a lot more of that.
Great. So thank you both for really thoughtful answers. I want to turn now to Zakat. And I'd really be remiss, my life's work has been in education. And being a part of the university, I see students from all walks of life, and increasingly over the last 2 decades, I've seen really amazing Muslim young men and women coming through Ryerson. What role do you see Zakat playing in furthering the importance of university education, in supporting universities, and in supporting universities like Ryerson? And I think philanthropy, Muslim philanthropy, as giving to the broader community, as sharing for those in need, can be really specifically applied to the university in interesting ways. So Nabila, first to you, Zakat, universities, how can we promote the importance of philanthropy in the university sector? Chris, over to you after that.
Yeah, so reflecting on this, I think it's more than just Zakat, right? Zakat is one aspect of faith-based giving in Islam. There's also sadaqah, right? Zakat is very prescribed. It has to be a certain percent, as you said at the beginning, Anwar. It's only you can only be provided to there's certain qualifications that must be met in order for it to be considered zakat. And then there's sadaqah, which is the concept of just giving. And you can give in many forms, and Chris mentioned to it earlier, right? You can give with your money, you can give with your time, you can give with a smile. And so I think one of the things we also know, and I'll talk specifically about the youth, and I think the potential here is we know we're living in an age of anxiety. We know that our youth are struggling more than ever. We know anxiety in university, in the workplace is growing exponentially. And long after COVID, we're going to be facing a pandemic of mental health for a very long time. One of the things that we know is anxiety, also scientifically, we know that anxiety and gratitude can't coexist. Gratitude and giving. And one of the reasons most people give is because that sense of that dopamine rush, that sense of that you give and you get, that feeling of giving that comes with that's a sense of a feeling of gratitude. And I actually believe that, if we can re-educate our youth about the power of gratitude and giving, we can actually give them a remedy to the kind of the anxiety that a lot of people are facing, especially our youth, especially youth in university, and I think in school. And there's a virtuous cycle there that I don't think we've really figured out how to unlock. And I think schools and universities can play a really big role in that. And I think generous futures and the view of philanthropy, kind of tying it to our own well-being, and how it can be a source of wellness and well-being and for us as human beings, is something that I'd love us to spend more time on. We don't have time right now, Anvar, to spend some time on, but how do we unlock that virtuous cycle in the conversation is one thing I really would love to see us do. And I think universities can play a big role in that, especially universities like Anvar or Ryerson and the work that you guys are doing. I think the other aspect of it is there's also a dimension of redefining success. One of the concepts, this isn't specifically around zakat or sadaqah, which are the forms of giving in Islam, but one of the concepts tied to this is a concept called risk, which is that there are provisions that are provided for everybody. And, often university students define success as that job I'm going to get, right? And your career placement. And if we can kind of help students think differently about success and tie these concepts, this ancient wisdom, this wisdom that exists in Islam around zakat and sadaqah and risk, and help students think differently about their success and expand the definition of success to be more than just educational achievement or professional achievement. But what if we define success as the success of your community? What if we define success as the success of your well-being in conjunction with professional achievement and educational achievement? I think this is going to change. It could change a lot of how we educate and how we set up the next generation for the future. So I think there's so much in here that I'd love to see us expose in universities and in educational systems and have a broader conversation about. So really long answer with a lot in there, but you asked, so.
I asked and you answered, and guess what? I'm going to hold you to the second conversation that I think would be really quite amazing. So just watch out for my email and don't ignore it.
I will be there.
Over to you, Chris. I think you're on.
I muted myself. Yeah, here we go. So this is the question about being good allies.
This is a question about the role of giving and giving to the universities so that we can build, given that our students are coming from all walks of life, how can we tap into this really important dimension of Islam where giving back is so critical in philanthropy and philanthropy in the university sector?
Well, I think for universities, it's all about providing a great experience for your students. If you provide that incredible experience to your students as they graduate and go on and get older, they'll look back and realize what a special time in their life that was, and how honored they are to be able to be in a position to give back now and support that. And what I loved, I went to University of Michigan. I felt so included as a Muslim, as a member of the Muslim Students Association at Michigan. You talk about Nabila, and I think this is absolutely true, that a lot of times at let's say the corporate level, we're very uncomfortable talking about race, we're very uncomfortable talking about religion. But I felt at Michigan, it was very inclusive of all of that. In fact, when I was there, 2 of the 4 years I was there, our organization, the Muslim Students Association, won Student Organization of the Year, and like we got prizes, and the provost would come and meet with us, and it just that was incredible. We were really part of the student body. We were so anyway, giving your students that experience will be a great investment for them and for the university itself.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions that have been sent to us from the audience. So the 2 of you have been so phenomenal that I've never wanted to interrupt what you've been saying. So I'm going to just pick and choose a couple of things very quickly. I'll do 2 different questions and ask each. I'll direct it to one person, and then the second question I'll direct to the second person. So to Nabila, and again, you've touched on this, but think a bit more about this, please. Islamophobia is clearly a global phenomenon and has been around for a very long time. Give some examples of how charities are working across borders to address systemic change.
Yeah, so I mean, I think obviously there's a lot of work happening. I think you can look at global organizations like the UN, UNHCR. We'll take the refugee crisis as an example, and the work of the UNHCR as an example of that. When the refugee crisis hit its peak in Europe during the Syrian war and conflict, and there was a mass amount of refugees, escaping and seeking refuge in Europe. What it did is it showed it exposed the systemic biases and anti-Muslim hatred that existed in Europe. And I remember at the time working at IKEA, and there was legislation being proposed to ban the hijab in federal and civic roles. And so as an enterprise, the organization was saying, well, what do we do? Do we follow the trajectory that is being proposed in the government, or do we stand for something else? And what's our position? And I think that's the right, question that needs to be asked. And of course, then you have to go to a local organization that has the expertise. So partnering with local non-profits, partnering with local advocacy groups, partnering with organizations that do this work on the ground, and say, how do we show up in the best way possible as an organization on this issue? And how do we make sure we support our associates and our employees in alignment with our values as a company? And I think that's the kind of, and then we go to the UNHCR and say, how can we help? What role can we play in the macro issue? And then locally, we go to local organizations to say, how do we support either philanthropically or using our size and scale through employment, through education, through partnerships to address the local challenges that we're facing on the ground. And I think that those steps are the steps we take every time there's an issue that needs to be addressed, where we need to both deploy individual resources, our organizational resources, and challenge the way that things are happening. We did that same thing recently at Walmart Canada with the influx of Afghans coming to Canada as well. We have the conversation on a global scale, we have the conversation with local partners, and then we figure out how we can support.
Great. That's fabulous. And even here at Ryerson, we did Operation Lifeline Syria, and leaders across and faculty and staff across the university actually sponsored many families, raised money, etc. Last question to you is, what is the most important message we can pass on to the youth of our community to help address these broader issues? And Chris, I'll turn to you on that one.
Well, I would say, if we're saying, just to clarify, are you saying the general public, not Muslims, yes, but what can the general Canadian public pass on to general,
their kids? And Muslim youth in particular, but youth in general.
Yeah, I mean, I was stunned. I knew Islamophobia was bad, but when Nabila is saying that 46% of Canadians don't like Muslims. Like that's 1 out of every 2, like every other one, right? And I think we have to teach our kids that, you don't have to agree with somebody, but you have to respect them. And we're all citizens of the same country, and we have to like one another and work with one another. And it's not acceptable to let ourselves be filled with this hate, and it's just, it has to just reach that level. No one would tolerate like someone saying, oh, I don't like Black people, and even if someone's felt like that, they could never say it openly. They could never, it's just because it's something that is just completely unacceptable in society. Thank God, at this point. And we need to do the same with, when people, whether it's Muslims or Sikhs or, any religious minority group is like, no, hey, there's actually a lot of common ground. They have their beliefs and we have our beliefs. That's okay. Each teach their own, but we're all in this boat together.
Yeah, great. The two of you are amazing. I wish we had another hour with you. So I am being told we're very close to the end of our time. So I'm going to give each of you 1 minute, starting with Nabila. Give us one statement, Nabila, that gets to the heart of your perspective on the future of generosity in combating Islamophobia. And then Chris, once Nabila is done, I'll turn to you for that.
Yeah, so I'll go back to my previous statement on what universities can do. I don't think we fully understand or have unlocked the power of giving as a virtuous cycle and how it can change, not just change your state as an individual, change the state of society, and I think change the trajectory of the world, to be completely honest, not to be, to be ambitious, right? So I would love to see more research on the power of giving. I'd love to see more businesses understand the power of giving. I'd love individuals to understand the power of giving. In Islam, Zakat and Sadaqah is a cleansing. It actually eradicates sin. And again, giving and generosity can't coexist with anxiety. So it actually has an offset in your personal state as well. So I think the more we can help people understand the power of giving and the implications that giving has on us as individuals, the potential of an organization and on society, I think the more powerful, the more powerful this venture will be. But I don't know that we fully unlock that. I don't know that enough people understand that. And so I'd love to see that happen for the future. And I think then I think anything's possible.
I think the power of unlocking the power of giving is an amazing one statement on your perspective. It really is phenomenal. Chris?
I'd like to go back to that, saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that even a smile can be charity. And not to discount, and that's actually, another statement of the Prophet, never discount the good, even the smallest act of charity. Maybe you're smiling at somebody today, or you just see a Muslim and you smile at them and you light up their day, and they'll smile at someone else and it starts to be contagious. We know that smiles can be contagious. And in the same way, I think, charitable feelings can be contagious. And that's what we need to do as a society. We're dealing with one pandemic of, with this COVID, but we need a different type of virality to go, one of generosity and hope and a future of, we pray peace and belonging for everybody.
So to both of you, this has been a phenomenal discussion. You're amazing panelists. I could listen to you all day long. I'll hold you both to a future panel. I will say I'm more than impressed with everything you have said. I really like the idea of unlocking the power of giving. And Chris, your last comment about giving is contagious. Put together, I think they form a wonderful roadmap for philanthropy and charity, not just in the Muslim community, but in all communities put together. So from me and from all who are with us today, a huge thank you to both of you for your perspectives, for the amazing work you do in our community. And a huge thank you to our lead sponsor of the Generous Futures panel, the TD Group. Your leadership is commendable, truly, truly commendable. Thank you as well to our promotional partners, the Association of Fundraising Professionals of Greater Toronto Chapter, the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, and Community Foundations of Canada. And to our audience today, thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining us. Please look out for emails in your inbox in the incoming days with a link to a recording of this discussion. Please share it widely with your networks. And we hope that you will join us on December 9th for our next Generous Futures panel discussion titled Dismantling Anti-Asian Racism. And a quick little side plug, today Horizon is hosting a 2-day conference on combating anti-Asian racism in society and in the university as a whole. So these details will be coming to you in your inbox. Nabila and Chris, I really can't thank you enough for being with us today.
Oh, you were a great host, Anvar. Thank you.
And thank you for all the work you do on behalf of our communities, our society, our city, and our countries. So thank you for being with us. To the audience, thank you. And I'm sure you agree with me that they were wonderful panelists. So amazing. And I'm going to hold you both to future discussions.